Today, we're going to explore something profoundly powerful: how to discipline your thinking. Now, when we talk about undisciplining the mind, we're not referring to suppression or rigid control. What we're really talking about is directing attention, managing internal dialogue, and shaping thought patterns in ways that serve us mentally, emotionally, and behaviorally. The human brain is not designed for constant clarity. It's a survival machine wired for reactivity, distraction, and bias. But here's the good news. With deliberate practices, you can rewire the way you think. And when you do, you gain access to a whole new level of focus, productivity, and emotional regulation. Your prefrontal cortex is responsible for focus and decision-making, but it's easily hijacked by novelty and emotion. Awareness of this dynamic is the first step to mastery. Your eyes are part of your brain. Narrowing your visual field, like focusing on a single point, reduces internal chatter. Practice this before deep work or reflection to sharpen cognition. Within the first 30 minutes of waking, practice stillness or journaling. This aligns your thinking before the brain is pulled into reactive mode by digital stimuli or stressors. When caught in rumination or anxiety, shift focus to breath or physical sensations. This redirects neural circuits from the default mode network to the present moment. Exposure to mild discomfort, like a cold shower or a brisk walk, activates the noradrenergic system, sharpening mental clarity and self-regulation. Label intrusive or unhelpful thoughts. TIS is catastrophizing, or TIS is narrative building. Naming deactivates the emotional charge and engages your executive function. Ask, will this matter in a week, a year? This reframes the thought in a broader time context and quiets urgency-based distortion. Anchor your day with 2 to 3 key intentions or core values. When the mind wanders, return to these anchors. They create stability in the mental landscape. Your environment shapes cognition. Keep your workspace minimal. Schedule time blocks for focused work and recovery. Protect your brain's rhythm. Take 5 minutes to review your day. What worked, what didn't, what will I adjust? This reinforces adaptive thinking and primes your brain for quality, rest, and integration. The way we pay attention is not random. It's governed by very specific neural circuits that operate largely beneath our conscious awareness. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral region, plays a major role in directing focus and suppressing distractions. But it doesn't work in isolation. It interacts constantly with deeper brain structures like the basal ganglia and the thalamus, which help filter sensory input and decide what gets our attention. What's important to understand is that attention isn't just a mental act. It's a physiological process. It requires energy. It costs neurotransmitters like dopamine and acetylcholine. Dopamine marks what's salient, what matters. Acetylcholine helps you lock onto it. When both are working in tandem, your brain can maintain high levels of focus. But when you're fatigued, sleep-deprived, or overexposed to novelty, like scrolling through apps all day, those systems get depleted or scrambled. Attention is also highly competitive. There's a constant battle between top-down processes, what you want to focus on, and bottom-up processes, what your environment or internal states pull you toward. If your nod will default to whatever is loudest, newest, or most emotionally charged. Understanding this helps you see that attention isn't just about trying harder. It's about managing the system, creating environments with fewer bottom-up distractions, aligning your goals to activate top-down pathways, and timing your most important mental work for when neurochemical conditions are optimal, typically early in the day, after light exposure and movement. You don't need to be perfect. But if you know how the system works, you can start to guide it consistently, skillfully, and on your own terms. Your visual system is the most dominant input system for the human brain. In fact, nearly 40% of your brain's real estate is devoted to processing visual information. That's not just about seeing. It's deeply linked to how you think, how you feel, and how you direct your focus. When you narrow your visual field, literally focus your eyes on a single point in space, you send a signal to your brainstem that it's time to concentrate. This triggers a shift from a diffused, alert state to a more tunnel vision, task-oriented state. Your pupils constrict slightly, your breathing slows, and you begin to reduce background noise in the brain. This isn't a metaphor. These are measurable changes in neural activity and autonomic function. You are literally adjusting your state. On the flip side, when your gaze is panoramic, when you allow your vision to soften and take in the broad environment, your brain enters a more relaxed, creative, and exploratory mode. That's great for idea generation, stress reduction, and spatial awareness. But if you're trying to solve a complex problem, resist distraction, or push through deep cognitive work, you need to bring your visual attention into a narrow channel. This simple shift in how you use your eyes changes the internal landscape of the mind. This isn't about straining or forcing attention. It's about leveraging a built-in system. The eyes are not just cameras. They're part of your central nervous system. They're the only part of the brain that resides outside the skull. When you adjust how you see, you're adjusting how you think. Try this. Before you begin a task that requires deep concentration, sit for 60 seconds and fix your gaze on a single point. Something non-stimulating like a dot on the wall or a neutral object. Don't analyze it. Just hold your gaze. You're priming your attentional networks. You're telling your brain this matters now. Pay attention. By anchoring your internal state with visual behavior, you're no longer relying on willpower to focus. You're using biology. That's the difference between effort and skill. When you first wake up, your brain is in a highly plastic and impressionable state. The neurochemistry of this window, marked by elevated levels of cortisol and low acetylcholine, is designed to orient your system toward alertness, but it's also vulnerable. Whatever inputs you give your brain in the first 30 minutes will shape the tone of your internal state for hours, and often unconsciously. If the first thing you do is reach for your phone, check social media, or dive into email, you're essentially outsourcing your mental direction to external stimuli. You're handing over cognitive control before you've even established your own framework. That primes your system for reactivity, not intentionality. A morning reset is about using this transition from sleep to wakefulness as a window to anchor your cognitive and emotional trajectory. This doesn't need to be long or complicated. Even 5 to 10 minutes of deliberate mental structuring can recalibrate your entire nervous system. The goal is to shift from a passive, externally driven state to an active, self-directed one. Begin with something analog and grounding, light exposure, for instance. Sunlight on the eyes triggers a cascade of neural activity that sets your circadian rhythm, regulates cortisol, and enhances alertness. If natural light isn't available, bright artificial light directed into the upper visual field can work as a secondary option. After light, stillness. Sit or stand without stimulation. Don't immediately fill your space with news, podcasts, or notifications. Let your brain catch up to the body. Let the internal dialogue start to take shape before other voices crowd in. This may feel uncomfortable at first, but that discomfort is a signal that you're shifting from habitual loops to intentional awareness. Then engage in brief reflection or intention setting. You're not trying to script the entire day. You're priming your attentional system. Ask, what are the 1-2 things I want to move forward today? What kind of mental state do I want to practice? This isn't motivational talk. It's queuing up neural pathways that bias your perception and behavior for the rest of the day. What you're doing here is simple but profound. You're reclaiming authorship over your mental narrative. Instead of starting your day in a reactive feedback loop, you're using biology and behavior to create a stable platform from which disciplined thought can emerge. The more consistently you do this, the less your day feels like something happening unto you, and more like something you're actively steering. That shift isn't just psychological, it's physiological. And over time, it fundamentally rewires how you think, choose, and act. When your mind gets caught in a repetitive thought loop, whether it's worry, self-criticism, or circular overthinking, it's not just a psychological event. It's a pattern of neural activation, largely driven by the any-fault mode network. This system becomes dominant when you're not engaged with the external world, when you're introspecting, daydreaming, or ruminating. It's useful for reflection and planning, but when unchecked, it easily spirals into anxiety and mental rigidity. One of the fastest, most effective ways to disrupt that loop is to shift the brain's network state, and the most direct route is through the body. Neural circuits that govern physical sensation, like those from the insular cortex and somatosensory pathways, operate in a different mode from the circuits that fuel mental chatter. When you direct attention to bodily sensations, like the feeling of your breath, your heartbeat, or the pressure of your feet on the floor, you're redirecting resources from rumination networks to present moment awareness systems. This isn't theoretical. Brain imaging shows that focusing on interoception, your internal bodily state, can downregulate activity in regions responsible for self-referential thinking. You're essentially rerouting the flow of information in the brain. So when you find yourself looping on a thought, try this. Pause and drop your attention into a specific physical anchor. Feel the texture of your breath, not just its rhythm, but its temperature, its weight. Notice the contraction and expansion in your rib cage, or bring your awareness to your hands, how they feel against each other, or how gravity pulls on them. This isn't about avoiding the thought, it's about shifting the context in which that thought is occurring. By activating sensory pathways, you reduce the intensity and stickiness of the thought loop. Over time, the brain learns that these patterns aren't mandatory, they're optional. This approach is powerful because it's biologically driven. You're not using willpower to argue with your thoughts. You're changing the underlying physiological conditions that allow those thoughts to persist. And once you learn to shift state on command, you're no longer held hostage by your own narrative. You're directing your mind through the body, a strategy that's not only effective but trainable. Deliberate exposure to cold or intentional movement is one of the most reliable ways to shift your mental and physiological state, rapidly, measurably, and without the need for external tools or stimulants. When you immerse yourself in cold, whether through a cold shower, an ice bath, or even splashing cold water on your face, you're activating the body's end-sympathetic nervous system. This isn't just about willpower or toughness. It's about triggering a precise cascade of neurochemicals, including norepinephrine and dopamine that increase alertness, elevate mood, and enhance your capacity to focus. What's remarkable is that this surge in neurochemicals isn't fleeting. Studies show that even brief cold exposure can lead to sustained increases in dopamine that last for hours, creating a powerful afterglow of clarity and motivation. Cold also increases heart rate variability, a marker of improved autonomic nervous system balance once the stressor is removed. In other words, you're temporarily stressing the system to teach it resilience and regulation. The key is deliberate use. You're not just reacting to cold, you're using it as a 1A training stimulus. That's why context matters. When you consciously choose the discomfort, you teach the brain that stress is not necessarily a threat, it can be a tool. That shift in interpretation rewires how your mind responds to challenge more broadly. Movement, especially when it's intentional and rhythmic, like walking, cycling, or mobility work, activates the motor cortex, increases end-brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, and enhances connectivity between brain regions responsible for executive function and emotional regulation. It also promotes the release of serotonin, which stabilizes mood and supports long-term mental clarity. Crucially, movement also engages the vestibular system and proprioception, systems that ground attention in the present and pull you out of ruminative loops. If you're mentally stuck, emotionally foggy, or cognitively fatigued, the worst thing you can do is wait to feel better. Thought alone doesn't reset state, but the body can. You can use cold or movement, especially early in the day, as a reset lever. You're not trying to punish the system, creating a short, controlled stimulus that forces adaptation and clears mental static. This isn't about being extreme. It's about being intentional. Just a few minutes of cold exposure or 10-15 minutes of deliberate movement can flip the switch from mental drift to cognitive engagement. You're training the nervous system to respond, not react, to focus, not flinch. And that's how you build disciplined thinking, not through force, but through precision. Most people assume that thoughts just happen to them. A fear pops up. A self-doubt narrative unfolds. A memory resurfaces, and the default response is to identify with it, to believe that the thought isn't you or that it reflects some deeper truth about reality. But from a neurobiological standpoint, a thought is just a transient pattern of neural activity, an electrical chemical event driven by associations, context, and state. The mistake isn't in having the thought. The mistake is infusing percent with it, automatically believing it, reacting to it, and letting it dictate behavior. There's a simple but powerful way to disrupt this fusion, and it begins with something deceptively basic, naming the pattern. When you name a thought for what it is, that's catastrophizing, that's perfectionism, into that black and white thinking, you create a small but critical shift in how the brain processes that event. You're no longer in the thought, you're observing it. This simple linguistic act recruits the prefrontal cortex, your executive control center, and dampens reactivity in the limbic system, particularly the amygdala. It's a move from being immersed in the experience to having agency over it. This isn't about judging the thought or trying to suppress it. It's about recognizing its shape and classification, much like labeling an emotion, KISS is anxiety or TISS is frustration. Naming a cognitive pattern creates a buffer. It provides space. That space is where you gain the freedom to choose your response instead of being driven by reflex. From a neuroscientific lens, you're engaging metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking. This taps into large-scale networks like the e-default mode network, which handles self-referential processing, and the salience network sets, which decides what's worth paying attention to. When you name a pattern, you're training these networks to work together instead of letting them spiral out of sync. It also allows you to conserve cognitive energy. The brain consumes a tremendous amount of glucose when it spins in mental loops. Naming helps you exit those loops faster. It's like identifying a familiar trap before you fall into it. For example, let's say you're preparing for a presentation and a thought arises, if I mess this up, it'll ruin everything. Instead of following that narrative down the anxiety spiral, you pause and say, first, catastrophizing. That's not positive thinking. That's not self-reassurance. That's pattern recognition. And that recognition changes the signal-to-noise ratio in your nervous system. You're saying to your brain, TUS is a known pattern, not a unique crisis. This practice is cumulative. The more often you name your cognitive patterns, the faster the brain gets at identifying and redirecting them. You're building a form of internal pattern recognition that increases resilience and decision-making capacity under stress. Over time, the goal isn't to eliminate negative or irrational thoughts. That's not realistic, nor is it biologically possible. The goal is to be able to spot them, label them, and let them pass without letting them drive behavior. That's what it means to have disciplined thinking. Not rigid control, but flexible awareness. You're not suppressing the mind. You're training it. You're moving from identification to observation. And that's where true cognitive autonomy begins. Your brain is wired to prioritize immediate threats, immediate rewards, and immediate discomfort. That's a survival mechanism rooted in evolution. What's happening now, what might go wrong next, and what could go right in the short term has always carried more weight than what's a week, a month, or a year away. But that same mechanism, while useful for avoiding danger, can become a trap when it comes to disciplined thinking. When you're locked into a moment of stress, doubt, or emotional turbulence, your perception of time collapses. The brain's salience networks, particularly those involving the anterior cingulate cortex and the amygdala, become hyperactive. They narrow your focus onto the most immediate signals. This is why something minor, like a critical email or a delay in progress, can feel massive. It's not that the event is large, it's that your brain's lens has zoomed in so tightly that there's no space to see anything else. Temporal framing is a tool to expand that lens. It's a way to override the brain's bias for the urgent and immediate by deliberately inserting perspective, not in an abstract philosophical sense, but in a neurobiologically informed way. You are literally shifting your brain's operational context. When you ask yourself a question like, will this matter in a week, in a year, in 5 years, you're activating networks in the prefrontal cortex associated with long-term planning and abstract reasoning. These are the same regions that get suppressed when you're emotionally reactive. By posing that question, you re-engage the parts of your brain that allow for distance, objectivity, and executive function. There's also a strong connection between time perception and emotional intensity. Studies show that when people are deeply anxious or angry, they report time as moving slower. Conversely, when they're grounded and calm, time seems to pass more fluidly. So when you zoom out, when you mentally shift from what's happening right now to how does this fit into a broader trajectory, you change not just your thinking, but your physiological response to the moment. This is especially powerful when you're dealing with intrusive or looping thoughts. Thoughts tend to gain power when they're fused to a narrow time window. Conscious mistake will ruin everything. Some can't recover from this. These statements only feel true because your brain has collapsed the future into the present. But if you expand the timeline, the threat loses its grip. The narrative weakens. It becomes part of a longer arc, not a defining endpoint. This isn't about denial or bypassing emotions. It's about training the mind to place events in proportion. If you habitually zoom out and contextualize, you build neural circuits that favor resilience, flexibility, and measured responses over impulsivity and panic. Temporal framing can also guide goal setting and motivation. Short-term gratification is almost always more emotionally compelling than long-term rewards because the dopamine system is tuned to proximity. But when you consistently frame your decisions in the context of future identity, who am I becoming through this action, you begin to align the dopamine system with delayed outcomes. That's a shift in neurochemistry, not just mindset. It's worth remembering that every thought and every emotion arises within a context of time. When you control that context by deliberately stepping back, zooming out, and expanding the frame, you gain leverage over how that thought or emotion impacts your behavior. You reduce its urgency. You increase your options. And over time, this becomes a habit, not just of thought, but of perception. The brain becomes more skilled at distinguishing what's momentarily uncomfortable from what's truly consequential. And that's a foundational element of disciplined thinking, not being cold or detached, but being precise with your attention, measured in your responses and calibrated in your judgment. That kind of control doesn't come from forcing yourself to think positively. It comes from understanding how your brain works and then training it moment by moment to see beyond the moment. Your brain doesn't default to clarity or intention. It defaults to energy conservation and prediction, relying heavily on automatic loops, habits, and emotional priors to determine what you do next. Left unchecked, that system will drift toward distraction, reactivity, and over-identification with whatever stimulus is most salient in the moment. That's not a failure of character. That's the way the nervous system is built. But you don't have to operate on default. You can install what are effectively uncognitive guardrails. Structures in the mind that constrain attention, filter out unnecessary inputs, and keep your thinking aligned with your goals. These guardrails aren't fixed beliefs or rigid scripts. They're mental anchors, deliberate reference points you choose and return to again and again, especially when the system starts to drift. What does that look like in practice? Let's say you're in the middle of a cognitively demanding task, writing, studying, solving a problem, and a wave of internal resistance hits. You suddenly feel restless. The mind suggests checking your phone, jumping to another tab, or walking away. That impulse is driven by a spike in limbic activity, the part of the brain that's always scanning for friction and avoiding perceived threats, including the discomfort of effort. If you haven't established an anchor in advance, you'll default to avoidance. But if you've installed a mental anchor, something like, right now, my only job is to solve this one piece, or this discomfort is data, not danger, you immediately change the meaning of the moment. You don't fight the distraction with willpower, you contextualize it. The prefrontal cortex re-engages. You stay on track, not because you suppress the urge, but because you had a reference point that reduced its signal strength. These anchors work because they create internal structure. The brain loves structure. It reduces decision fatigue, lowers emotional reactivity, and frees up cognitive bandwidth. You're not trying to manage every thought as it arises. You're building scaffolding around the task so that irrelevant thoughts have fewer entry points. Anchors can be verbal, a phrase you repeat, visual, an image or symbol you associate with your goal, or procedural, a ritual or sequence that signals to the brain, it's time to focus now. For example, some people write a one-line intention before beginning deep work. That simple act engages the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region associated with task maintenance and rule enforcement. It's like setting a compass bearing before navigating through fog. Another example, using your breath as a physical anchor. When overwhelm or indecision rises, deliberately returning to a slow nasal exhale for even 30 seconds activates the parasympathetic nervous system. That isn't just calming. It rebalances the ratio of excitation to inhibition in the brain, allowing for more measured and intentional thinking. Over time, these anchors become self-reinforcing loops. The more you return to them, the more the brain links them with specific outcomes: clarity, control, momentum. That association strengthens the neural circuitry involved, particularly in the anterior cingulate cortex and insular cortex, regions that monitor conflict and internal state. The result? You become better at catching drift early and redirecting with less effort. None of this eliminates distraction or confusion entirely, but it makes your thinking resilient. Instead of being pulled in 100 directions by every new input or emotion, you have a home base, a place to return to. A cue that reminds the brain, this is what matters right now. Disciplined thinking isn't about never getting off track. It's about shortening the gap between drift and return. And that's exactly what mental anchors allow you to do, reliably, deliberately, and with increasing precision. The more you install them, the more your cognitive system becomes a tool you control, rather than a landscape you get lost in.